Prosecutors say it was an execution. A man appeared in court today, charged with shooting and killing his wife at a Milwaukee motel. Our Bill Miston was there, as was the victim's family.
Lance White is charged with first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Alicia Matchnik. As White walked into court today, Matchnik's family cursed him out from the gallery. The 29-year-old Matchnik was found in a room at the Port Motel near 97th and Appleton last week, shot in the head. Surveillance video showed White and Matchnik checking into the motel a couple days before. And the day Matchnik was found dead, video showed White leaving the room, and no one else was seen going in or out until Matchnik was found. Filings say White later showed up to his mother's house looking disheveled and dirty. She drove him to St. Luke's, where he was later arrested by police. In an interview, filings say White said he and Matchnik stayed in motels and were, quote, getting high together when she told him to shoot her, allegedly because she was afraid of her child's father, who was getting out of prison within the year. Filings say White admitted to shooting Matchnik and fled the room in shock.
If the allegations are true, if it's true you gave a statement saying what you said out of respect for the family, I'm not going to repeat what you said. Then you point blank shot someone intentionally, which would be an execution.
A commissioner set White's bond at $300,000. He's due back in court next week. In Milwaukee, Bill Miston, Fox 6 News.
A woman is now charged in connection to an arson near 22nd and Hampton. 48-year-old Lakita Spears appeared in court today. She's charged with arson, along with 2 counts of first-degree recklessly endangering safety. That fire started inside of an apartment building last week. Prosecutors say that Spears admitted to lighting a jacket on fire during a disagreement with her family. It forced 150 people out of the building. Some were taken to the hospital for treatment for smoke inhalation. Court records mention that Spears has 2 prior convictions for arson of a building.
Surveillance doesn't lie. It watched them check into that motel together. It watched him leave alone. And for days, nobody else went in or out of that room. Until they found Alicia Matchnik, 29 years old, shot in the head. The cameras told a story Lance White couldn't escape. In every home, behind every closed door, there's a story waiting to be uncovered. Welcome to Dark Whispers, where we dive deep into the hidden truths of domestic crime and the relationships that turn deadly. If you're drawn to real stories, powerful insights, and the shadows most people avoid, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and step into the whispers they never wanted you to hear. Alicia Matchnik was 29, a mother, a woman trying to navigate life the best way she knew how. She was involved with Lance White, her husband, and like a lot of relationships that end in tragedy, theirs had layers most people on the outside never saw. Alicia had a child. The father of that child? He was locked up. But word on the street was he'd be getting out soon. Within the year, actually. And according to what would later come out, that had Alicia shook. Real shook. Now, Lance and Alicia's relationship? It wasn't picture perfect. They had their struggles. Drugs were in the mix. Life was messy. But nobody outside that relationship could have predicted how it would all end. Let me tell you something. It started with a motel room, the Port Motel, near 97th and Apple in Milwaukee. Not some fancy spot, just one of those places people go when they need to disappear for a minute, you know? Lance and Alicia checked in together. Surveillance cameras caught it all. The 2 of them walking in, getting their room, settling in. They stayed there for a couple of days. What were they doing? According to Lance's own words later, they were getting high together. That's the reality of it. 2 people, a motel room, and whatever substances they could get their hands on. But something shifted in that room. Something went terribly, horribly wrong. Alicia was scared. At least that's what Lance would tell police. Scared of her baby daddy getting out of prison. Scared of what he might do when he got out. Scared enough to, well, we'll get to that. For now, just know that in that motel room, whatever conversations were happening, whatever substances were flowing, the tension was building. and Lance White had a gun. Here's what we know happened. In that room at the Port Motel, Lance White shot Alicia Matchnik in the head. One shot, point blank, execution style, as prosecutors would later describe it. Now, Lance's version of events. He says Alicia asked him to do it, told him to pull that trigger, said she was terrified of her child's father coming home from prison, and she wanted out, wanted it to be over. But here's the thing about that story. It's coming from the only person who walked out of that room alive. What we do know for sure is this. Alicia ended up dead on that motel room floor, a bullet in her head. And Lance, he ran. Surveillance footage picks him up leaving the room, alone, disheveled, moving quick. And from that moment until Alicia's body was discovered, not a single soul went in or out of that room. The cameras don't show anyone else. No mysterious visitor. No random intruder. Just Lance, leaving his wife behind. The body was discovered about a week later. Housekeeping, probably. Or management doing a welfare check. Either way, when they opened that door, there she was. Alicia Matchnik, 29 years old, gone. Milwaukee police were called. The scene told them everything they needed to know. Gunshot wound to the head, close range, no signs of struggle that suggested someone broke in. This wasn't random. This was personal. Detectives pulled the surveillance footage. And girl, that footage became the backbone of the entire case. It showed Lance and Alicia checking in. It showed their movements. And most damning of all, it showed Lance leaving by himself. But where did he go? Turns out, after Lance left that motel, he showed up at his mother's house. And listen, when he got there, he looked rough, disheveled, dirty, like he'd been through something traumatic. His mother saw the state he was in and didn't ask too many questions. She just got him in the car and drove him to St. Luke's Hospital. Now, whether she knew what happened or was just trying to help her son, we don't know. But what we do know is this. Police were already looking for Lance White, and when he showed up at that hospital, they were waiting. Officers approached him. They took him into custody, and that's when Lance started talking. In his interview with detectives, Lance admitted to shooting Alicia, said it plain as day. He pulled the trigger. But then came his explanation, the one that would become the center of his defense. Alicia asked him to do it. According to Lance, they were getting high in that motel room when Alicia started talking about her fears. Her baby's father was getting out of prison soon, and she was scared of him, scared of what he'd do. So scared, Lance claims, that she told him to shoot her, to end it right there. Detectives listened. They took notes. But here's the reality. Lance's story didn't change the facts. Alicia was dead. Lance admitted to killing her. And no matter how he tried to frame it, prosecutors saw it one way: murder. Lance White was charged with first-degree intentional homicide. That's the big one in Wisconsin. Premeditated murder. The kind of charge that carries life in prison. When Lance appeared in court, the pain in that room was thick. You could feel it. Alicia's family was there in the gallery, and they were not holding back. As Lance walked in, they cursed him out. Loud. Raw. The kind of grief that turns into rage because what else can you do when someone you love is gone like that? The commissioner handling the bail hearing didn't mince words either. Looking at the evidence, looking at Lance's own confession, he said it straight up. If the allegations are true, if it's true you gave a statement saying what you said, then you point-blank shot someone intentionally, which would be an execution. An execution. Let that sit for a second. The bond was set at $300,000. Lance was going back to jail, and the case was moving forward. Now, here's where things get real complicated. Because Lance White's defense wasn't that he didn't do it. He already admitted that. His defense was that Alicia wanted him to do it, that she was so terrified of her child's father getting out of prison that she begged him to end her life. Think about that for a second. He's saying this was mercy, that this was what she asked for. But prosecutors? They weren't buying it. Not for a second. See, there's a big difference between what someone says happened in a room where only 2 people were present and what actually happened. And when one of those people is dead and can't tell their side, that's when the story gets dangerous. The state's case was straightforward. They had surveillance footage showing Lance and Alicia entering that motel together. They had footage showing Lance leaving alone. They had the timeline. Days passed with no one else entering or exiting that room, and they had Lance's own confession that he pulled the trigger. The defense tried to paint a picture of a woman in crisis, a woman so consumed by fear that death seemed like the only option. They wanted the jury to see Lance as someone who was put in an impossible position, someone who was just trying to help the woman he loved escape her terror. But the prosecution had a different narrative. They called it what it looked like: premeditated murder, an execution. And that word kept coming up: execution. Because when you shoot someone point blank in the head, when you're the only one who walks away, when you run and hide and only get caught because you show up looking guilty at a hospital, that doesn't scream mercy killing. That screams murder. Alicia's family sat through every moment of those proceedings. Every time Lance's attorney tried to paint Alicia as someone who wanted to die, they had to sit there and take it. Every time the defense suggested she was too afraid to live, they had to hear their daughter, their sister, their loved one reduced to a narrative that served Lance's freedom. And honestly, the pain in that courtroom was something you can't put into words. These were people who loved Alicia, who knew her as more than just a woman in a motel room. She was a mother. She had a whole life, and now she was gone, and the man who killed her was trying to make it sound like he did her a favor. Let's talk about something that can't be ignored in this case: the drugs. Lance admitted they were getting high together in that motel room. That's not speculation. That's his own words. Now, when substances are involved, things get murky real quick. Judgment gets clouded. Reality gets distorted. And conversations that happen under the influence, they don't always mean what someone says they mean. Did Alicia actually ask Lance to kill her? Or was that something said in a moment of being high, scared, and not thinking clearly? Was it even said at all? Or is that just the story Lance told himself, and then told police to make sense of what he'd done? We'll never know Alicia's truth because she's not here to tell it. But what we do know is this: being under the influence doesn't make you pull a trigger. It doesn't make you shoot someone you claim to love in the head. That's a choice, a deliberate action. And Lance made that choice. The prosecution made sure the jury understood that. They emphasized that even if Alicia had said something in a drug-fueled moment of fear, that didn't give Lance the right to take her life. Because here's the thing: if someone you love is in crisis, if they're scared, if they're talking about not wanting to live anymore, you get them help. You don't shoot them. Let's circle back to Lance's mother for a minute, because her part in this story raises questions. When Lance showed up at her house looking disheveled and dirty, she didn't call the police. She didn't ask what happened. She just put him in the car and drove him to the hospital. Now, maybe she didn't know. Maybe she just saw her son in distress and acted on instinct, the way any mother might. Or maybe she had a feeling something was wrong and didn't want to know the details. We can't say for sure. What we can say is that by the time they got to St. Luke's, police were already looking for Lance. They'd connected the dots. They'd seen the surveillance. They knew Alicia was dead, and they knew Lance was the last person seen leaving that room. So when he walked into that hospital, officers were ready. They arrested him on the spot. And just like that, the man who thought he could run, who thought maybe he could disappear or explain it all away, was in custody. The walls were closing in. The case against Lance White was built on a few key pieces of evidence, and honestly, they were strong. First, the surveillance footage. This was the smoking gun, if you will. The cameras at the Port Motel captured everything. Lance and Alicia checking in together, the days they spent in that room, and then Lance leaving, alone, moving quick, looking like someone who knew exactly what he'd left behind. No one else entered or exited that room after Lance walked out. Not a single person. That meant there was no mystery shooter, no random attacker, no third party involved. It was just Lance and Alicia in that room, and only Lance walked away. Second, his confession. Lance admitted to shooting Alicia. He told detectives he pulled the trigger. Now he tried to justify it by saying she asked him to, but the fact remains. He confessed to the act itself. And in a murder case, that's huge. Third, the physical evidence. Alicia was shot in the head at close range. The forensics supported what the surveillance already showed. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't self-defense. This was intentional. And fourth, Lance's behavior after the fact. He ran. He showed up at his mother's house looking wrecked. He didn't call 911. He didn't try to get help for Alicia. He just left her there and tried to figure out his next move. All of these pieces together painted a picture that was hard to argue against. Lance White killed Alicia Matchnik. The question wasn't if he did it. It was why, and whether that why would matter in the eyes of the law. The defense's struggle. Lance's defense team had an uphill battle, because how do you defend someone who already admitted to the crime? Their strategy was to lean into the narrative that Alicia wanted to die, that she was so terrified of her child's father that she saw death as her only escape. They tried to make it seem like Lance was acting out of love, out of a twisted sense of compassion. But here's where that argument falls apart. Even if someone asks you to kill them, it's still murder. The law doesn't recognize "she asked me to" as a valid defense. There's no legal justification for taking another person's life just because they say they want to die. There are proper channels for people in crisis: therapy, intervention, protective orders if someone's genuinely in danger. But a bullet to the head in a motel room, that's not help. That's homicide. The defense knew this. They had to know. But they also knew that Lance's only shot at avoiding a life sentence was to make the jury feel something. Sympathy, doubt, anything that might soften the blow. They presented Lance as a man in an impossible situation, a man who loved his wife and was trying to protect her from her own fear. They painted him as someone who made a terrible choice, but not a malicious one. The prosecution countered every bit of that. They reminded the jury that Alicia wasn't there to speak for herself, that Lance's version of events was convenient for Lance. That calling it mercy didn't change the fact that a 29-year-old woman was dead, and her killer was sitting right there in that courtroom. Throughout all of this, Alicia's family had to sit and watch. They had to hear Lance's excuses. They had to see him try to twist the story to make himself look like something other than what he was: a man who killed their loved one. The anger in that courtroom when Lance first appeared? That was real grief. That was the kind of pain that comes from loving someone and then having them taken away in the most violent, senseless way possible. Alicia's family didn't just lose her that day in the motel room. They lost her twice. Once to the bullet Lance put in her head, and again to the narrative his defense tried to spin about who she was and what she wanted. And for a family already dealing with unimaginable loss, that second violation cut just as deep.